The practice of making freedom of information requests in itself is a very simple one, but when you come to the more detailed request and sort of making a sort of complicated request and sort of getting really down to the details, then it becomes a lot harder to actually complete the process. So there are multiple exemptions in the Act. There are 23 odd exemptions, and each one of these has got its own different precedents, its own case law, and basically in between all of them it's a lot harder to really refine the request to make sure you try and get what you want rather than just making a request, which is the process in itself is simple. There are generally two types of exemptions in the FOI Act, and they're not really loopholes because they're part of the legal mechanism of the Act itself, but there are two types, qualified and absolute exemptions. One is subject to a public interest test, so a public interest test means that if the information is in favour of being in the public interest, then it is disclosed, then it has a greater weight against being disclosed rather than being withheld, whereas an absolute exemption, there's no public interest test. So one of the major areas of one of the main exemptions which is used is personal data, which is related to the Data Protection Act, and that's the main exemption that's used, and that's to try and protect people's data, but then again it's not always used in the correct ways. In terms of personal data, it depends on each circumstance, but if a request is about MPs, they've got a lower expectation of privacy than those who are sort of general members of the public. So if you are trying to get personal data about an MP or about somebody who is in a high-profile, powerful position, then you've got more of a chance of getting the information from them than if it was about just the general man in the street. If politicians aren't documenting, and civil servants as well aren't documenting their decisions, the reasons why they're making decisions, then that's a huge problem to the accountability and also transparency of the organisations that they're looking at. And if this is the case, and there's been very few examples of politicians actually saying yes, this has happened, so it seems to be sort of a myth, I would say, which politicians use to hide behind. But if it is happening, then it shouldn't be happening, because these people are elected into positions of power, and they should be held accountable to the public and to the people who pay the taxpayers who pay their wages. As more public services are outsourced to private companies such as G4S, Serco, there's a grey area in terms of transparency, because these companies aren't subject to FOI requests. They're not subject to the same levels of transparency as in the NHS, even though they're running some of the same and similar services. So it's a case of these companies being as transparent as possible, and I think there should be clauses written into the contracts that they make in terms of when they're outsourced from the public sector to the private sector. There should be contracts in place and terms in their contracts which say that they should be answering FOI requests related to the projects that are subject to the public taxpayer money. So it's not a case of all private companies or private companies that are doing public works being completely covered by the FOI Act, but for the work they do, which is funded by the taxpayer, they should be covered and they should be accountable to the taxpayers.